Welcome everyone. We're going to make the tables smaller so we could fit more people in. At one point, significantly more people were booked into the conference, but we've actually had a number of speakers drop out. You'll see a few amends, and you and Leach can't come and things now, but the school strikes really did for us. Also, you can all know today that you've missed out on Cora's excellent conference on a very similar theme that is in Glasgow today, with very similar work about placemaking. So if you've got buyer's regret, it's probably too late to switch conference, I'm afraid. But we actually invited them before they arranged their date, so that was a shame. Today, you've got agendas in front of you, so I'm not going to terribly dwell on this. But today there's three things we're trying to do. So one is we call the conference Lifting Neighbourhoods Out of Poverty, which is the same as we called it last year. It's the sort of overarching aim of where the thoughts crystallised and that led to the work we've done. And I'm going to tell you about the Lifting Neighbours Together programme, which is the lottery-funded programme that we've been doing. But I'm really going to try to emphasise talking about the learning rather than too much about the doing. Last year was a lot about kind of the start of the lessons in how we were doing the work, and I'm trying to concentrate on the learning about what we're finding from it. And we've been doing that in Edinburgh, and we're going to hear from Antje, who's been trying to, I'm currently going to say replicate, but I'll come back to the word replicate because I find it difficult, in a neighbourhood in Walker. We're going to listen to what some other organisations are learning about whole person or whole place working as well. We talk about the work we do as being whole person, whole place system change. So we're going to hear a few examples, but this is where there was a bit of a reshuffle of people not being available at the last minute. So of the about 8 people, the 4 we've got speaking there, I think will be really insightful. But there was a few more that I'll reference a bit later. You'll just have to pretend you listen to them and go away and learn all their work as well, because it's fascinating. And then we're kind of getting to the point in the afternoon of saying, so what's the emerging learning, and therefore what national action might there be? I'm a big fan about saying, if you're not doing work at a local level with a mind to say, I can learn about something with the person in front of me, I can learn something in this team, I can learn something about this place, in this neighbourhood, in this service, I can learn about how that works regionally, but also have a sense of how this could inform something at national level, I think you're missing out. We don't need answers at national level necessarily. We need to know how what we hear on the ground can be mirrored or be fed up into those national learnings. So we're heading that way. As I said, Catherine, who's organised all of this, is much more organised than I, and insisted I put a slide in about housekeeping because I had indeed completely forgotten about these basic things. So there's not going to be a fire test today. There's a fire exit here, but the main exit you came in, it's a little bit awkward, isn't it, to get in and out of this room. And if you go into the cafe bit and then through to the right of the main door, that's where the toilets are if you haven't been already, and I understand that is an accessible loo if someone needs it, but you'll have to ask where that is. You've all offered photo consent. I'm just reminding you that if you don't want that, go and speak to Michael at the back. Oh gosh, there's a lot of numbers on this. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through them all. Your heart probably sank. I promise I won't. So I'm actually using this slide to represent what we're not talking about. So Community Renewal Trust is a group. We deliver work in Glasgow, which is led by and for Roma people. We have a neighbourhood, Community Renewal Pennywell, which operates in West Hilton and Muirhouse, where we do work. We have a consultancy social enterprise we run and a funeral poverty social enterprise we run, as well as the Lifting Neighbours Together work we're talking about today. So this is a long way of saying we're only going to talk about one of those things today, but this is our whole group, what we've been doing last year in total, which we're quite proud of, and even my colleagues I don't think have seen this. We literally just been making this just now. But we're only talking about one part of it. But we are talking about the part where we're putting all our effort into the learning. It's always difficult. We're an organisation that tries to do some thinking and tries to do some doing. And we think doing those things together is really important. And in this team, the Lifting Neighbours Together team, it's really been about focusing on learning, trying really hard to do new things, even when it's really difficult. Sometimes in other places we'd maybe take the easier road, and we almost always take the harder road in this team. But we've achieved a huge amount across the board. And as these kind of signs try to set out, this is just one of the things we do. Here's what you could have had last year. We're running 3 of these conferences. We ran one last year, which I've actually cropped some of the speakers off, but there's a reason for that. We had these speakers and some other speakers at last year's conference, and then next year we're going to do a conference as well to sort of finalise what we've learned over this process. The reason I picked out these speakers is they all raised a very related theme last year, which is going to come back and back in the next 45 minutes as I'm doing my presentation. And that's broadly this diagram here that they were saying. That all the plans you make are really important. Don't stop planning. All the ways in which we try to conceive the world are really important. Don't stop trying to conceive the world. But actually, everything's really messy. Economies are really complicated beyond you can even comprehend. Even when you think it's complex, it's even more complex than that. People's lives on an individual basis are complex. People don't get better in a linear way. That's just not true. People have all sorts of other things going on in their life. Society, neighbourhoods, everything's complex. And our solutions to that don't always need to be the most complex. They are really hard sometimes, and today we're going to talk a lot about how hard this is. But they can be relatively simple in practice if you're focusing on learning and you're focusing on kind of an approach that you can iterate. And then the other thing we did last year was some lessons. We did some lessons in how we've been experimenting with data use at a really, really local level, and we did some lessons in our core methodology for speaking to people one-to-one, which is called a holistic conversation. And bless her, Sheila did an excellent job of pretending to be a client with a whole bunch of needs and acting masterclass, really. All of this stuff's still available on our website. But this year we're going to shift away from the kind of too much of an explanation of what we did. Right, so I've offered myself just 1 minute to summarize my entire thrust of my presentation last year. Basically, we set out the predicament that informed why we came up with Lifting Neighbourhoods together. I think it's fair to say, and there's lots of cliches in here, don't worry. So, public services and third sector services find themselves in silos, okay? There's no two ways about it. It doesn't always happen. It's not even always a problem. There are some specialist services where that's fine. But that is the status quo. Where people who live real lives in the sort of neighbourhoods we work in will be experiencing lots of journeys where services are trying to do a very linear process to them. They say, we took you in, we assessed you, we found you were broken, and over the next months or weeks or single engagement, whatever, we're going to try to move you forward in your life towards a better life. And they're going to accidentally be doing that in parallel with a bunch of other services that they're not really speaking to very much. Humanity is saved by the fact that we're really nice people who try to fix each other. This is sort of, altruism and philanthropy. But actually, as I think lots of you in this room who deliver things will realize, fixing things is one way of trying to make a difference, but actually helping people help themselves is a much more powerful way of building resilience and long-term impact. And actually that drive to sort of fix things and step in where there's an issue and add a sticking plaster it's a human instinct. So we shouldn't be dismissive of it, and sometimes it's the right answer. Sometimes you need a doctor with a medical degree to tell you exactly which drug will save your life. That's absolutely essential. But if all of the things we do that are often much softer community-based work are in that paradigm, then we've got a problem. And finally, the fact that, the distribution geographically of which neighbourhoods are rich and poor just doesn't change really much. There's a couple of exceptions, but it just doesn't change. Where you live makes an unbelievable difference to what your life's going to be like. And if your life does happen to get better, most people would choose to leave the neighbourhood they're in, despite the pride they might feel. Despite that, the experience of 20 years at Community Renewal was all the people we transformed their lives, such a big percentage of them ended up leaving. So you lose the dynamic, you lose all of the relationships. So we came up with Community Renewal Lifting Neighbours together as a sort of way of testing this. It's not meant to be a panacea, a silver bullet. It's meant to be a testing and learning process, okay, in which we bring together a team and we see how best we can use whole person and whole place initiatives. We had a 5-year program, very kindly funded by the lottery. Realistically, it's a 3-year program because of COVID. We did fantastic, important work during COVID. I could talk about it for 4 times as long as this presentation. We've bagged that. That's not the learning that's going to take us forward particularly. That did its job, it was great. Thank goodness we were there in this most deprived neighbourhood in Edinburgh, which is Bingham, Magdalen Hayes. Thank goodness. Building Futures East, we're in Walker in Newcastle where it's being delivered. But realistically, we've got a 3-year project and we're roughly halfway through. The neighbourhoods we're working in are both around actually Walker's 10,000 people, Bingham, Magdalen Hayes is 4,000 people, but in Walker really they're starting with just, they're not trying to bite off more than they could chew all at once. We've a premise in Lifting Neighbourhoods together that's small, working with a team that can just about get to know at least something about everyone. So you might not know the person you're working with, but you might know their auntie, you might know, the primary school teacher that their kids go to school with. You know something about each other. And my brief introduction to whole person, whole place support that we're, whole person, whole place, the green looks very exciting. Is the following 4 slides, sorry. So, what do we mean by whole person support? Well, Lifting Neighbourhoods Together tries, as so many other programs do, to say, let's try to be there for the whole person. It's as simple as that. There is something about saying that could mean you came in with any one of these needs, or if you were talking to us and we identified any one of these needs, we could try to connect you to the support you want. We try to build your resilience or ability to make your own change in terms of benefits, to try to understand the benefits system rather than just have a benefits check, for instance. We could try to make it so you had some support around your well-being that was actually in the moment and helpful, and not just a referral. But actually, fundamental and kind of before all of this is we think that the whole person bit is about making relationships with people. So rather than us being there to fix broken people who are in crisis, we're there to try to make relationships and have a trusted relationship with people in this community. Not everyone you're going to have a positive relationship with in a community. We're talking about 4,000 people. Of course there's going to be people where it's difficult. But to be there fundamentally to try to say, if we build a bit of a bond between us, and there's trust both ways, by the way, not just trust in us, we need to trust them to get on with the things they do, then maybe we can have a more whole person, a more holistic way of supporting people. That in practice is built of 4 elements, I often say. It's built on listening to them in great detail, and that being an entire discipline in itself. It's built on connecting people to the thousands of services, even just in Edinburgh, that in some way talk to one of these 8 bits. Literally thousands of different services. So it could be about connecting to those, and connecting people to other people and services is a discipline of itself. Building on their strengths in a sort of community development, asset-based community development way, building on people's strengths so they're the agents of their own change, is a huge bit of work, and again, a discipline in its own, if you see what I mean. But if our team could just do all of these things, that'd be grand, wouldn't it? And what we call sticking with people as long as it takes, which isn't about people being a service user forever. I hate the idea of people remaining being a client with us. They need to move on in their life. They need to go through that change to take control. But we'll always be there. We're not just swooping in as another 3-year project, although we are 3 years these days. I should stop being so dismissive of 3-year projects. Swooping in as another 3-year project, comes into a neighbour, does great work for 3 years, it kind of disappears as a sticking plaster. We've been in it for the long haul, we're going to be here for the long haul as a team, and even if this programme technically ends, the approach is continuing. We're committed to that in the long term. And fundamentally, we believe it's about transforming people's lives, breaking that cycle of intergenerational poverty, persistent poverty, the fact that this neighbourhood in Walker this neighbourhood in Walker and this neighbourhood of Bingham, Magdalen and Hayes in Edinburgh, these are the most deprived parts of the country. So how do we break some cycles? How do we make transformative change? Not just help people with one of those issues. Someone comes in, they've got a benefits issue, we do a benefits check, we get them benefits, they go away. How do we break that into a conversation that's about transforming someone's life? And the bit I was saying before where Sheila and Paul were doing a role play last year of our holistic conversation, basically leading to this question, which I'm possibly blocking, which is, what would a much better life look like in 18 months' time? Our whole methodology in terms of trying to speak to people is about, you need a relationship, you need to listen, connect, all these things. These are really, really hard things for a team to do. But all you're trying to do is walk towards this question and have something where you can start inspiring people. Not inspiring people through a great, pep talk. Inspiring them by realizing that they know deep down what they want in their life. And this isn't it. And between you and they, things need to get better, and they need to do a lot of the heavy lifting for that themselves. Answering this question, even for yourself, what would a much better life look like in 18 months' time, is hard if you don't have the preamble. But this is the basics of our one-to-one support we're doing in these neighbourhoods. However, we don't do that alone. There's lots of people doing whole person support, and I think it's great. The direction of travel is brilliant. We see lots of people going on this journey with us. We're not the only ones saying that that's the right approach. But we also notice a whole group of organisations, people in this room particularly, who realise that a whole place approach is important as well. If you combine a whole person and a whole place approach, you have a much more powerful weapon. So whole place might mean responding to things where you can't just do that on an individual basis. I could describe what community development is at great length, and you'll all be bored stiff because you know all about it. But community development is just saying we can create not just one-to-one support that works, we can create the local assets, we can nurture the local activism that helps groups set up and people support each other in their place. We can respond to environmental issues. How often do you find that the thing that motivates someone to turn up at your door is something like the play park's full of rubbish? So they're not responding to something in their own life, they're responding to community need, and then through that route you can engage them in a discussion about their own transformation. The fact that they're stuck in a life they don't want to live. Maybe their family members are. How can you access them? And having a whole place approach for us, we're adding a particular element in, which is we use that to find the people we want to support the most. We're going to come back to this in a bit. Rather than wait for people to be in crisis and turn up on our door, we can go out proactively and find them. And our biggest weapon in that is door knocking. Probably the most work we do goes into organizing events, things that can help build a relationship with people who you don't know and start that process of getting towards trust with someone by just discussing whatever they want to talk about. They're at an event, they don't want to bang on about their damp in their house at that point. They want to talk about something nice. You're on their door, they don't want to talk about the fact that, oh yeah, if I come along I could have a session about my mental health. They tend to say things like, oh, you know, the litter's really bad down there. And you say, oh, what would you like to do about that? Would you like to bring some friends who could do something about it? Start and build a relationship. There is an aspect of us using data in this whole place approach, but fundamentally, by combining a small whole place approach in these neighbourhoods with this one-to-one work, we think we're making a really big difference. We're not the only people in this space, but the learning we're doing, I think, is really interesting. And we're trying to do it with a bit of system change. There were easier ways, it's fair to say, of doing this without system change. System change is hard. System change takes all sorts of forms. So yeah, there's system change that involves, for instance, convening partners and trying to work out how you can make better referrals between each other, try to understand things. People who work in other organizations are also humans. It seems like something that we've come to realize almost, having previously been trying to make everyone part of an organogram or some sort of diagram that sits in some council office of mapping. So getting out there and meeting people. There's other bits of system change where it really overlaps with community development. Community development has massively undersold itself for its entire life by not using the current management lingo of system change. We changed systems in the sense of, well, there was a community centre next door to us which was completely closed because of COVID, had no chance of being open this year. But because we were there and we had the ability, we had a team of people, we were able to open it and let them use it. We took the risk basically on having that. It sounds small, but like a whole bunch of change makers and activists in the community were able to use that as a result of that. Didn't always buy as the most favourite. Don't mind adding. Community relationships can be quite difficult, but change can happen that way. Having your eyes open to be like, it's worth our while trying to make these changes happen out with things that are very important to us in this moment have become important. We've got an interesting new bit that we've sort of catalysed, setting up around the recovery and substance misuse community and the people in the whole of Craigmillar who support that in organisations and how we can better join that up. We've got a community forum reactive in the neighbourhood in Edinburgh, in fact probably in both, but I'll let Ange tell you about Walker. I'm going to talk about Edinburgh once or all the rest. And we've managed to set up I think it's 11 organisations in this tiny neighbourhood of 4,000 people, most of which didn't exist a few years ago, by the way. We've got about 11 organisations and we've formed a community wealth building alliance between us. It doesn't mean we've done a lot. It doesn't mean it's all fixed. It doesn't mean we really understand exactly what community wealth building will mean. But it's brought together people who'd never bothered to speak to each other and were just getting on with their own thing. And immediately opportunities arose. You know, how could the growing people provide the food for the pantry? This kind of stuff. The programme also set the pantry up as it happens as well. I don't think the picture there. Saw the picture in the last one. A community pantry rather than a food project. This kind of work takes effort. And the kind of programme we were doing, it was really important that people were able to raise their heads. Right, this is the part where now you've listened to what we do. This is the part where in our 3-year project where we swoop into a neighbourhood and do things, we list off a massive list of bullet points in which we have absolutely no failures, and everything in our project is absolutely brilliant, and this is what every project does in its midpoint. It spends its whole first year talking about how fantastic things will be, we're mobilising, come and join us, you know, we're here for you, come and we'll recruit you, and then you spend the middle bit saying, wow, oh, we've nailed it. We've nailed it. And then in the third year, you actually disappear because your project's about to end anyway, and you've got excited by whatever the new thing coming down the pipeline is. So I think these bullet points are broadly true, but I don't want you to read them. This is a load of rubbish, okay? Maybe this is because my ceiling fell in, but that's the end of the normal presentation. I actually think we need to be a bit more esoteric. So I've got a small point I want to raise on the next page, right? The world is on fire, people are dying in abject poverty, and people are dying of abject poverty. So I just think it's too late for us to bother trying to have more projects which report in, and you know, you've given your time today, which is amazing. I don't want to just go through the motions of saying all these things work well. I think we have to wear on our sleeve the things that we find aren't working, but also the things we spot in the system, where even if it's a bit of a risk to us, we want to point it out. Is the world on fire? Oh, hang on, I'm a slide out. Is the world on fire? Well, so Chick Collins from Glasgow Centre for Population Health was doing a presentation at Edinburgh Community Health Forum, where I'm a trustee the other day. So I've stolen one of his slides, the plant hides. I did attribute it to him, but there you go. This is Glasgow, not Edinburgh, and I'll explain why in a second. The blue line shows a decrease in mortality for females working age just consistently over decades. We were building into the system the idea that people would get older and have better, longer lives. And then since 2015-ish in Glasgow, that's no longer been the case. The green line shows that, as we well knew, people in affluent neighbourhoods had lower mortality, morbidity, and lived longer lives. But even their like decades-long improvement in life expectancy and their ability to live a good life has like plateaued off. For people in the poorest neighbourhoods, in the red, an unbelievable increase in their mortality, morbidity. Okay? I think the world is on fire, and I think people are dying in and of poverty, and I think we should point that out. The reason I've used the Glasgow numbers is probably because Glasgow's a bit ahead. My subjective opinion of this, don't take this as science, I did a fair bit of work in Glasgow, Newcastle and Edinburgh over the last decade, or more than a decade actually. And a decade ago in Newcastle, they were talking about the same kind of budgetary cuts that they were talking about in Glasgow 5 years ago, and we talked about in Edinburgh over the last 3 years or so. So I think there's like a staggering of where these things come in, and I didn't have the Newcastle numbers because Chicks deals with Glasgow. There is an Edinburgh number. It's less dramatic, but you can imagine it just basically shows the beginning of that uptick that's happening. I understand as well that people hate graphs. So there'll definitely be half this room that is like either, maybe you understand it, but you're like, is the world really on fire? People dying in poverty? So I think this is more impactful to me. This is a photo from the really wonderful Dying in the Margins exhibition that was on recently. I'm so sorry, I forgot her name. Margaret Mitchell was the photographer, and it was arranged. And if you didn't get a chance to go, there was basically there was a whole set of boards, each of which was an example of someone who in the last few years has died living in poverty. I'm not saying they're all dying of poverty, by the way. That is a much harder question. You can't always put a pin on who dies of poverty. But the experience of people dying in poverty, and this guy, Andy, is just one of dozens of examples that were told as very personal tales. And I'm not going to go into too much detail, but so he couldn't talk. He had throat cancer, you can possibly tell in the picture. And he was completely estranged from his family, had no money. And what really caught me about this example was his main aim in life, as he realized he was dying, was he didn't want to disclose who his family members were because he didn't want to pass on his debts to them. So his life focus as he was dying was that he was so poor he didn't want to tell people who his family members he was estranged from in case they followed up with some debts and bills. I just think we're at such a point we need to start trying to understand the world. We can't fix it. We're not going to come out of this conference having fixed anything, right? But we can start the process of unpicking which bits are worth spending a day talking about. So we've had COVID. Could anyone stand here and not do a talk in which you say we've had COVID, the cost of living, third sector, public sector, costs have gone up, there's a recruitment and retention crisis, I think it's fair to say. We had austerity, we now have severe budget cuts. Is there really much hope in the future? I hear people kind of give this sense that we're going to come out of this crisis. Actually, if you look at the long-term projections from Institute for Fiscal Studies, for instance, are basically saying we're either going to have massive tax rises or like decades of ever severer austerity of some sort. So we're not going to end problems with our delivery of public sector services, third sector services tomorrow. And my perception, and forgive me if you don't see the world in the same way, is that I see in these last couple of years, public sector and third sector services, different pockets of them. So I'm not saying one and the other, but just mean different pockets of people in each of those have tended to fall into one of these two camps, okay? Either the world is just so awful, demand has shot up, our costs are up, we've got not as many members of staff as we thought we would, it's really difficult to deliver, and people are sort of entrenched and fortified. They've made a little castle. They've got a very narrow window where they'll say, I will work with these people and no one else. That helps protect me. And that's important. You kind of can't get through life without doing this to yourself sometimes. There's no two ways about it. I'm saying that as someone who's got a toddler and occasionally used to barricade himself in his own room. Like, sometimes you need to be in a fortress. GP practices have been in fortresses for a long time, I think it's fair to say. They still do amazing work. They still work unbelievably hard and get burned out, right? But we know it's kind of hard to get into. They're not looking to be open. And the other set of people, and this is going to be a bit glib, so I do apologize, but are people where they've thrown themselves so far in, and these are frontline workers. I'm not talking about the kind of donkeys in the background. I mean, frontline workers in public sector services. There are people in the NHS, but also in every third sector organisation I've seen, who respond so emotionally and so vehemently to the crisis they see in front of them, that many crises and the high demand, and throw themselves at it with kind of the same old tools we've always had in our armoury, and inevitably get absolutely burnt to pieces for it. I think an example of this is, it won't be a surprise to people to hear me talk about, isn't it important to have trust and relationships with clients? It's not new, we just kind of talk about it a bit more these days. But our experience in Lifting Neighbourhoods together has been that where we've really achieved deep relationships and trust, it's often that opens a discussion about the huge trauma those people face. Because we're the only people in that person's life who's there for them, the only person with whom they can make that connection. So they offload, which is fair enough from their point of view. They offload trauma, disaster, the sense that someone has to do something about this, and there's no one apart from you, because I'm on a waiting list for this and a waiting list for this, I can't get an appointment here, I've got no support, things are falling apart, and it kind of all gets burdened on this, 20-something newly trained caseworker or something. It's a huge burden, and I think recognizing that we have this kind of dichotomy, I think, from my point of view, you might not agree, it is part of how we make some change. The next bit I want to talk about is basically related. Are we being honest about how much capacity there is in the public sector for system change? So our initial model for Lifting Neighbourhoods together was we'd have a few people that were delivering, that were basically funded by the lottery. That would bring a whole amount of internal secondment, I hate the word secondment, but we're stuck with it, from our own team. And at various points we've had 6 different projects where there's been team members kind of been seconded in. So there was at one point youth workers, there's been a couple of different types of community development workers, we've now got a welfare rights officer in this team, and it's that team that can do the one-to-one whole person work and the whole place work. Because if they combine those, they can have those relationships, they can make it so they meet someone at an event and they can genuinely be talking about the play park or litter picking or something, and form a relationship and then support them. And by being a team, multidisciplinary team with lots of different backgrounds, some of them know more about young people, some of them know more about welfare rights, some of them know more about employment support, we can make more impact. Maybe that person can't, but with their team members they can, and they can keep the consistency of working with that person. So you can keep the relationship, even if sometimes you need to look over your shoulder for the person who's got more expertise about mental health. We then wanted to second into that team, and we changed the language a little bit along the years, public sector workers. There was lots of enthusiasm for this in 2019. Something happened at the beginning of 2020, I don't know what, that meant that those offers of secondments dried up. It'll all sort itself out in a few months, everyone said. Once we're past this COVID crisis or whatever it is, we'll get back to this concept of secondment. We had potentially 13 people lined up ready to be seconded into our team. Even if half of those had done it, and even if they only did a couple of days each, we could have had a huge amount of resource for 4,000 people with a real chance of making a difference in that community. We have continued our end of the bargain. The public sector struggles. We haven't really held their feet to the fire about those commitments, because we can see that if we were withdrawing those, in some ways the people who are most on board with our suggestions, for instance the people who run the unpaid care support service in Edinburgh, they were saying, oh, maybe we could focus on this neighbourhood rather than kind of do a tiny bit of peripatetic work across the city. I don't want to throw them under a bus. I didn't want to go back to them now and say, oh yeah, give us those 3 days a week of one of your 3 members of staff, because realistically they're not going to be able to. They're in a recruitment crisis. They're just trying to hold things together. I'm not talking about them personally, but the people in the system are burning out. They face their own crisis. So our plans to bring people together into a public sector seconded team fell apart pretty early on in this process. And I don't mind saying now, we've sort of, there's other things we could do. We could maybe get one, we could maybe do something, but the ambition's fallen apart. I think we need to learn from that a couple of things. I think one is, it's still worth trying such things. Another is system change is difficult, and we're going to come back to that in a second. But the other is, realistically, how can we ask changes are made of the public sector system sometimes at the moment, when we know it's so close to falling apart, and in fact there are huge gaps formed? And how do we do that without being rude? It's no one's fault. People are going home every night stressed out that they can't run a service, they can't deliver as much as needed. And yet every document I read about public sector delivery starts with some sort of line that says, but don't worry, what we're going to do is a system change program, and then it'll kind of sort itself out, right? Well, you know, we've had excellent ideas for system change. In Edinburgh, the stuff around the Thrive Welcome teams, excellent, love it. And then not got to the place it needed to be. This week, just gone, Glasgow Alliance to End Homelessness just fell apart. One of the probably most promising system change programs we had nationally. I don't know, I'm not close enough to know why it fell apart, but it just fell apart. I can understand why it might have. Is there budget to make the kind of change that's needed to end homelessness realistically? Is there really an ability for everyone to set aside their own organisational goals, whether they're public or third sector, at the moment? Or are you just trying to fight fires? So, do we have that capacity at the minute? I think it's hard for me to say yeah. I'm going to just spend 2 minutes talking about why system change kind of sometimes does seem to fall apart, in my opinion. And then I'm going to steal some slides from someone else, so that's great, isn't it? So here's a way other people that I steal conceive of system change sometimes. So you're sat on the top of a rock, let's call it a hill, that'll help me. You're sat on the top of a hill in which you've delivered in a certain way, and you're aware that there's nowhere to go, and yet you're not as high as you want. You're not in the place you need to be. So you go through a process of imagining what change would look like. Visioning is really, really important. Actually, one of the lessons I think you're going to hear this afternoon from our evaluators is we've not done enough visioning, and we thought we were really onto this visioning thing. We were like, oh, one visioning session a year is enough. It turns out not close. But anyway, so system change starts with visioning. What would a system in which Edinburgh's early intervention and prevention was used to prevent long-term crisis? Oh, yeah, the Holy Land, we'll get there. So you're on this hill over here on the top, and everyone sits around in a few workshops. I'm sure there's sticky notes, and you know, everyone's going to draw on something and says, yeah, we want to go over here. And basically together in a room, people who know a bit about it try to imagine the bridge they would build between these two things and how to get on with it. And then what we call this kind of policy into practice disconnect, that seems to be the jargon we have at government level at the minute, is then for some reason the bridge never gets built. Well, how are you going to build a bridge? You're sat on top of a hill over here. You can't build from where you are. What process would you have for building a bridge from where you are? People come up with sort of a plan, but then the actual implementation is really, really difficult. And frankly, here's a bit where the obvious thing to do when you put this analogy in place is you need to climb down from the hill you're in, and you walk across and walk up a new hill. But that seems harder when you're on the, when you're already up. I don't want to give up what I've got. We're already delivering a service. I don't want to give up all the crisis support we do. We run amazing, citywide food crisis support. That's great. But sometimes we need to get into the conversation of how do we come down from there? How do you go across? And actually, this is the bit where I'm stealing someone else's slide. So if you haven't done ULab and looked at the Presencing Institute stuff about Theory U, you should. This is a stolen slide from them. You need to go down the hill and up the other side. We don't use this language internally very much, but this is what's in my head all the time when we're doing these processes. We need to sometimes we need to work out what's going wrong, which is one of the reasons I want to be kind of honest about some of the breakages that we might as well just say things as they are. So you need to download what's actually happening just now. And when we do things in the neighbourhood, that's exactly what we see. You can't know what's going on until you actually do something to it. You can't know a system until you change it up. You need to see with fresh eyes. So sometimes Sheila and I were having a conversation the other day, sometimes the team in Lifting Neighbours together, they do things and we're sure that's going to go wrong. We're absolutely sure that's not the right answer. That's strategically not quite there. But actually, it's important for the team to get on with it. Because then, we had an example recently where we arranged a really great class for toddlers. It was very well received. It was excellent. It's absolutely worth doing. But it wasn't something that really is going to change the system or sort of transform the lives of the parents in the way we'd maybe hoped. It just happened and it was good. It was fine. It was like any other project. It was fine. Did it. But the team afterwards, without us even going to them, were like, oh, next time we would do this different. We need to use the toddlers as a way to get to the parents. That's what now we know, yeah. So going through the process of trying, not succeeding all the time, seeing with fresh eyes, and then really letting things go. A couple of weeks ago I was thinking, do I say we've kind of given up on getting public sector comments in? Yeah, I need to let this go, right? We are where we are. We need to be honest about the public sector's capacity. We need to be honest about our own plans in that. But also, we've got great stuff nonetheless. So as you prototype, crystallize ideas and get on with it, you can start moving to your system change. And for us, that system change is about the whole person approach and the whole place approach. Okay, that bit's over. There's no more imagining to do. I've stolen someone else's slide, but I have credited them. This was someone who calls herself, I think, the creative clinical psychologist. I loved it. And it came with this tweet quote. No presentation's good without a potentially made-up quote by someone extraordinarily important in world history. I'm pretty sure it is true, by the way, but I'm conscious that these things often happen in presentations. Right. We do a lot of fishing. Everyone in the public and third sector does a lot of fishing people out of the water who are already in crisis. Okay. It happens the person who's made this is concentrated on this in medicine here and therapy here. They're interested in the implications around their discipline. But fishing people out of rivers is a big part. Who's doing the work of trying to fix the upstream bits? People who've been talking about asset-based community development have been trying to talk about this for years. All those policy plans do talk about how we deal with that. But how do we actually stop some of this? Because it's really difficult to stop fishing people out of the river. Like, the actual process is, we haven't enough resource to do both all the time right now. So if we're going to spend some time in our life doing something that's upstream problems, it means taking you away from the front line. An example in our delivery is that door knocking, community events don't always seem like the biggest priority when you've got a massive caseload of people who are facing poverty. And we're the ones saying, well, we'd just be bad cop here. Yeah, find some time in your week for that. We're going to keep banging on about it. We're going to see if we can find a few examples where it makes a big difference that gets the team on side around that. That's not anything to do with this team. That's a natural human instinct to want to help the people who are drowning in this river right now and they need help. I've mixed my metaphors. I was saying the world is on fire and now they're drowning, but you get the point. So I thought we'd talk together about this slide for a minute. Someone knocks on our door. I mean, this is fictionalized. So someone knocks on our door and says, I want food. My life, everything's fallen apart. You can imagine the person probably doesn't just say they want food. People feel a real need to justify these kind of things. So they'll go through saying what's wrong in their life. I'm not going to make up an example, but this happens all the time. I need a food parcel. I think if any of us sat in that room, we could probably work out how to get a food parcel. We need to Google it maybe if you don't have the connections. Like, people in our team would probably know a bit faster because they're in the right place, they know the right people. It's fair enough that we don't know, but you'd probably be able to help this person. If you don't help them, what does that mean about your humanity? If you're like, get lost, close the door, I'm not even opening the door to you. You can't, that's completely, it's not going to happen. It's just heartless, right? So that's off. If we say, yeah, come in, we'll absolutely help you. What if they then go away and come back tomorrow? What if they send their friends and family? What if a queue forms outside next week of people in crisis and we say, hang on, we were trying to do all this, we were trying to do this stuff, and that's not this. We can't do it. People don't come to our door and say something like, well, look, I just thought I'd have a chat because my relationship's broken down and I'm just worried about the long-term implications that might have on my finances. I'm worried about my long-term housing tenure and I just think that might be an issue, and if I lose some work I'll be at much higher risk, in fact 75% higher risk of persistent poverty, and I know you're interested in persistent poverty, John, so I've just turned up at your door. No one says this. They come and say, I need a food parcel or something. So navigating this, and I don't have an answer, I'm not trying to give an answer, but navigating this kind of problem is the space we should be in. So it is a problem. It's actually caused quite a lot of tension, I think it's fair to say, between staff members, to try to resolve this, because it's hard. And then what if someone tomorrow comes who we know really well and wants a food parcel, but we know them well, we've already done the work. We'd probably help them in a different way. So there isn't an answer. Don't go out thinking now we know what we should do in third sector organisations where people ask for food parcels. The point is there's a problem and it's intractable about how we balance up these two dynamics, about trying to get into long-term transformation talks. And it's absolutely hindered by crisis, by the system, and by us just being non-heartless humans. And it's really difficult, and I think the only way is to learn and try and learn and try and progress like that. By the way, I'm deliberately about to overrun by 5 minutes, so if you're looking at the time, because we're super short late. I'm saying that because you might think this slide is a load of nonsense as well. This is, it doesn't particularly matter who it's from. I'm showing this to show humans love logic to a fault. We love to categorize things. I mean, hands up if you like a logic model. Like, who doesn't like a logic model, right? You know, you're like, I don't know if that means I can show why this presentation I'm doing today connects in some way to making sure, like, Billy has a roof over his head in 3 years' time. So you want to connect these dots and how that maybe informs some bigger transformational issue. We like to kind of categorize. This is why sometimes specialist services should be in silos, and sometimes we're in a silo just because it's kind of more convenient for us. We're like, oh yeah, that sounds like a discipline that should be separate. It sounds like we should put that in a different building that was designed for use. We just love we love that. And I'm kind of using this to pivot into saying that assuming outcomes can be categorized and assigned from someone's complex life to a project or an organization is part of this. So last year we talked at length about this, and we talked about this very related diagram in the middle, the squiggly one. Sorry, I'm just going to hide that so I don't think about too many things. But outcomes is part of that, and the idea we've been on this journey where things used to get funded to say, you know, decades ago, be like, does that sound like the right thing to be done? Does that organisation sound like it's the right organisation to do it? Yeah, let's get them to put on some support or put on some events in the community stuff. Let's just do it without questioning it. And we moved to a managerial approach of saying, oh, what we can do is measure the outcomes. We can make sure we look at how a transformation happens in someone's life, and we'll get them to record it. Get them to record something like, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, how well do you feel today? And then when you come back, if it's gone up, we'll be like, yeah, that was good, it went up. We are responsible for your well-being going up. When in fact, people's lives, that's not true. It'll almost certainly be about what happened to them this morning. It'll almost certainly be about if their life gets worse, that might be a good thing because they're trying to sort out some of these long-term issues. And as someone who's sorting out their ceiling, sometimes when you're sorting it out, it gets worse. I now know it's going to cost thousands of pounds. I feel worse today than I did yesterday when I thought I'd escaped a near-death incident. Things can get worse, but it's part of the journey to getting better. So outcomes is a problem, basically. And even a small number of parts of the delivery you do when you're trying to bring the system together into sort of something cohesive and something that's about learning and adapting, even small amounts which are caught up on an outcomes paradigm can be a problem. It's no one's fault. Normally speaking, what happens is someone thinks that someone else wants this, and then someone above them will demand it. And if the politician doesn't have a talking point by which they can exactly say how many people, whatever, like entered work or claimed PIP or something, if we can't demonstrate that, the politician will be sad, and that means kind of everyone down the line. And actually, if you speak to politicians, they're often like, I kind of want a human interest story. That's more powerful. I'd rather my speech had a human interest story. So our discovery in lifting neighbourhoods together is even the small bits where this has been true have caused big problems. Not just the problems you'd expect. The fact that if you're going to measure an outcome and it's going to be assigned to us as an organisation, that affects your relationships with other projects that might be working with the same person who might also want a stake in that outcome, right? It affects your dynamic in your team because people are saying, well, yeah, okay, I'm working in this open learning relational way, but I also need to make sure I do my project outcomes correctly. And worse, it means that there's sometimes where you cannot get into a relationship with someone until you've ensured they meet the eligibility criteria for that particular outcome. And these things just fall, like, they're normal. Everyone who works in the third sector is completely used to this. But even small amounts in a very, I don't mind saying, well-funded system change, we're trying to think big program, cause a problem. So no wonder when we're trying to do this in the margins, it doesn't work. And the last bit on there, I kind of talked about change is normal. We had youth workers in the team. We're no longer an organisation that delivers youth work. Fine enough, turbulence happens. It's not something we shouldn't expect that a long-term program in a community is going to stay the same. And I have to say, my mind's moved on this. I was a bit like, oh, it's a bit embarrassing that we've had 2 different managers in post in this office. This is difficult. How do we get through this? Turbulence is normal. It needs to be about having an approach where a team's delivery and an organisational delivery where you end up being like the community anchor organisation isn't too badly affected by that, and it's normalised. I'm going to end with 2 case studies that I'll try to keep shorter than they could be, because you could talk about people forever. This is the same person I showed at last year's conference, because I thought it's worth having a check-in. So if you weren't here, we've anonymized this sufficiently, by the way. So he's not called Tony, I'll just say that, but we'll call him Tony. So Tony's in his 50s and lived in a damp terrace house. His relationship broke down, so he became a single dad, and one of his daughters was taken into care. But he had grown up having real trauma in his life as well, in all sorts of ways. He'd been in prison for a long while. But he's depressed, in debt, and he's so angry about how he's treated by the state. And by the way, this process started before the cost of living stuff, so think how much worse his life's got. But so angry about how the state was kind of treating him. Whenever he's tried to look for support, he was sort of, problematically, but probably not unreasonably, was really angry all the time about it and very hard to work with. And because of those things, doors shut in his face all the time. I can see why. Like, it's hard to work with, there's no two ways about it. We've had to have discussions internally. How much can we do for someone whose behaviour is difficult to work with? It's not that all people in deprived neighbourhoods are difficult to work with in any sense. But if you're going to work with people, you're always going to find people like this. And can you really just shut doors in their face? It's really difficult. How would he do with the silos that I was talking about, or kind of linear process of being assessed by all these different services all at once, and everyone trying to jump in and fix his life if it's something? Like, none of it's going to help, and actually he's not going to engage with any of it properly. He's obviously having a complex life. He's obviously part of an even wider complex life involving his family members and stuff. Waiting lists, gaps in public services. There's some real issues. So many. I'm never going to read. There's a list on front of me of all the things that, bless him, the team did with Tony that goes on so far. I can't see the end of the list, right? So I won't read it all out. But he was helped around his housing. He was helped around benefits. He had cash for grants. He became a pantry member. His daughter was helped in all sorts of ways, because it turned out it was more important to help her in some ways. They managed to make it so there was a bit where he could have his daughter who was taken into care back, home. Enormous change. Things that will have saved a lot of hassle in the public sector, saved unbelievable amount of money for the public sector. But he's not in a place where, you want the end of the story to always be, and now he's in work, and actually, he's a Rotary Club member who donates his millions of pounds to, of course that's not the way this goes. His life's hard. But he actually has slightly disengaged our support that we're offering him. Is that good? Hang on, I'm saying that in an upbeat tone. That's a good thing. He was needing to come and have weekly sessions. It was really difficult. He can do some more things on his own a little bit. It's a huge change for someone's life. It sounds so small. It's a huge change for someone's life. He has got reliable support from through the GP for medicine and mental health support, psychiatry assessment, which was basically brokered by a team member from Lifting Neighbourhoods together, managing to get a one-to-one chat with the GP about it. It took years to break these things. They're huge issues. But trying to make it so even now you're desperate to fix things in his life. You're like, if I had a few hours, I could try to deal with that. His life's not going to be fixed with any one intervention. It takes this kind of, endless run, and the fact that we're going to be there in 5 years' time when his life falls apart, and hopefully he still does live near us. He should know that you can come back and be helped a little bit more if you something. That's not what 3 year we're into a place and then we're out of place projects do. So it's unquestionable that I think that his life's better, although that might be offset by if he was responding here, he might actually be more caught up on the cost of living stuff, to be honest. But compared to where he would be, it is unquestionably better. But I think we need to be honest about how is the public sector going to cope with these kind of things? And thank goodness third sector organisations cope with these. Thank goodness there's some people who bravely run into the fray and deal with situations where they could really shut the door in someone's face if they wanted. But his daughter's lives are important. His life's important. We need to avoid a bottomless public spend on his life in which nothing goes forward, nothing gets better. And we need to avoid that cycle cascading down to his daughters. That was too depressing, so we're going to have a happy one for me to end on. Right. This is an unusual case study in that L herself isn't really a client as such. So there's a few people in this picture. Michael's at the back of the room, in fact. So one of our caseworkers, it wasn't actually Michael, he's just taking the credit for it. One of our caseworkers chapped on Elle's door, just doing door knocking. We're just out and about, didn't know her, no reason to know her. Knocked on her door, she answered. She was in the house, nothing to do. Basically, they just got into a chat. Turned out one of our team members and Elle had like nothing common to want to have a bit of a chat, talked about some stuff, put the world to rights. Elle had this idea that she wanted to do some creative stuff, and there was this opportunity where there's a community pantry that we run, well, the volunteers run it, we just kind of host it and set up, and they needed a recipe book of some sort that Elle thought, oh, I could go around and find recipes from this community that people might want to make, and that'll help, won't it? And so we went into this amazing, instant, dreamlike community development example of being like, all she needs is a tiny amount of support from us, but who else would it get it from? Who's got kind of a sort of open agenda to say, yeah, we'll have a go at that, that's fine enough. Yeah, sure, let's give it a go. In which she did all the heavy lifting herself and used her creativity to create a beautifully illustrated book, by the way, that we then were able to give out for free at the pantry. She variously ended up being sort of like a client, sort of like a volunteer, we ended up paying her as a staff member for a bit. She's sort of been in and out. We've also been able to support her family members. I think it's around employment support and stuff. So we've actually then accessed the people around her as well. She's at college now. So it turns out, as you well know, every community is full of assets. Like behind every door are people who can do amazing things for their community. And if they're making their community better, when their lives do get better, let's hope they want to stay. Let's hope Elle, in the long term, wants to be part of the story of this community and this neighbourhood. Let's make it so she's got sort of a stake in that. And on the journey, she's using in a tedious way, the vocational skills that she needed to get into college and things, but part of something bigger. And the reason I chose this particularly silly photo is because it happens that because we set up this little event at which STV and Edinburgh Live and things were like, oh, Elle, you're amazing, which is great. It was the first time we actually got to meet the 2 of the 4 councillors. And we got into a great conversation. I was talking about homelessness and damn. We actually made a really important connection with the 2 councillors for the area who have a whole bunch of other hats and insights and have been part of the housing policy stuff, lead on fair work. It was really important, but because of COVID, sometimes that's been difficult. So these things come together sometimes is all I'm saying. And I think that was great. Right. There's more words on this slide than all the rest, so I'm just going to leave them up there and say, I'm delighted by how this program's gone. And that's because we didn't set out with a mindset of saying, and it's going to be exactly like this all the time. There's some things we really stick with, like we're really passionate about a holistic conversation model. It seems to work well. We'd adapt it if we thought there was reason to. But like we're quite caught up on the fact that it seems to be very potent. But this idea of how you spend your time, what's the priority this week? How do we go about improving things? How do we find the changes in how we deliver that will make the biggest difference? We've done things like introduced case conferencing and the way we do meetings that I actually think has made an enormous difference. Just because of the management of this team. It's made an enormous difference, but it's a small thing. But we're all about trying to learn and adapt. And in the one-to-one support, we're trying to learn and adapt. We're forming relationships, we're listening, we're trying to make it so we're curious with them. And this seems to be working really well. And basically the rest of today is about saying, are there other people who work with whole person stuff? Are there other people who work with whole place stuff that mean that we can start to say, are we really getting to something that we can diagnose that's more than just our neighbourhood's success and failure? I'm about to hand over to Antje just now, because and I promise I won't say all the things that you need to say. Because Antje has been using our approach that we have done over 20 years at Community Renewal Trust. We've been doing in this one, in Bingham, Magdalen and the Hayes. She's taken that approach and tried to run with it in a completely different neighbourhood, although one that's got some similarities in Fairness and Walker. It's made me realise that we need to move away from some language we were using about replication. 4 years ago, we'd have said, Antje's job is to replicate what we're doing. And in many ways, that gives her no agency for a start. But also gives the sense that complexity, remember that complexity diagram, can be replicated. It absolutely can't. So, convenient for someone who's just shown a picture of a cookbook. I think that's more about organisations like us, not just us, all the organisations that do community anchor work, that are at the front line, that are listening and learning from this, to do basically cookery school work. If we can try to help other people cook, they can go away and make their own recipes and do it in their own way, and that's absolutely fine. But there's some lessons we can do that are practical about how we do whole person, whole place work that we haven't talked about today, but can be passed on. Anyway.